Dr. Buttery to the emergency room. Dr. Buttery to the emergency room.
Is something wrong, Doctor?
No, not really. I mean, it's just, I never thought this day would actually come, you know?
I completely understand. Not many people did.
Go ahead and bring in today's patient.
Today, we have NRG. This team was known for their unmatched consistency within the RLCS, but they started showing their symptoms this season and reached a critical point during the spring. They failed to make the top 8 in 2 different events this split, and missed out on the spring major entirely. This means that for the first time in his career, Garrett G didn't qualify for an RLCS LAN.
Yeah, you didn't need to say that last part. Now you're kind of just rubbing it in.
Then why did you put it in the script?
I've been a fan of this team ever since Jacob was doing Jacob things for the Kings of Urban back in the pre-RLCS days. And even with all the different rosters that this team has gone through since then, I've always had a soft spot for this team and the players that they've brought in. That's why it's been so tough for me to watch them struggle this split, so I'm going to do what I can to address their issues. If you saw my last Dr. Buttery video, you already know how this is going to go. I'm going to talk about what changed that caused them to struggle, and then I'll talk about some potential solutions to these issues so I can do what I can to try to help out. Will they watch this video? I don't know. If they do, will they even care about what I have to say? Probably not. But I don't care and I'm going to do it anyways, so let's get into it. So first of all, I want to talk about what this team was doing well earlier in the season, because that'll be the best starting point for us to discuss where things started going wrong for them. And before these past few months, NRG was solidly at the top of NA for nearly the past 2 years. So it probably goes without saying that they did pretty much everything well, but there was always one thing that stood out about them more than anything else, and that was their defense. In RLCS, they allowed the fewest goals per game in the region, while also allowing the second fewest shots and the lowest shooting percentage. So not only were teams not able to get a shot off against them very often, but in the times that they did manage to get a shot off, it probably wasn't going in anyways. This great defense was mostly because of an effective and consistent system that helped to make sure that they covered all potential threats from the opponent. If you've seen some of my other videos, then you've probably heard me make this comparison before, and I swear that this will be the last time. But NRG and the previous iteration of BDS with Mark by 8 had really strong defenses ever since their rosters came together at the start of RLCS, and they both had very similar playstyles when it came to defense. Garrett and Mark were both the players that would go for early challenges the most often, looking to disrupt the opponent's possession before it began, while Justin and Monkey Moon were the players that would play the most backline defense, often after taking a wide rotation back to the defensive half, after leading their own team's offensive push. And finally, Extra and Squishy were the players between these two extremes, most often setting up behind the teammate who would go for the early challenges. If the ball got behind that teammate, they would shadow the play, looking to buy enough time before Justin and Monkey Moon got back to goal on their wide rotation. This system led to NRG and BDS being the best defenses in all of RLCS, but RLCS ended a year ago now, which might as well be an eternity for Rocket League. So let's move on to the present day. At the start of this season, NRG picked up right where they left off in RLCS and allowed fewer goals per game and a much lower shooting percentage. And while their opponents increased their total shots per game by over 1, that didn't end up being an issue for them at all because of how well they would save the shots that came in. And while the team as a whole saw a jump in saves per game, Garrett easily had the biggest jump, going from 1.38 saves in RLCS to 1.90 in the fall split of this season. So at this point, everything was still all good for them, at least according to the numbers. And even though their defense might have looked slightly different, they were still just as good as they had always been. Then as we move into the winter split, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Looking at the bigger picture, things were still fine for them, more or less. Heading into the winter major, they were first in points in North America for that split and overall. And even after a poor showing of the major, they still finished third in points for the split and were second overall to G2 by only 1 single point. But while things seemed okay looking at the surface, the stats were telling a different story, suggesting that NRG's situation was a little bit more urgent than I thought it was. In the winter split, there was a big jump in the number of goals they allowed and the shooting percentage they allowed. And while these averages may seem like they're skewed by an especially poor winter major, these are more or less offset by their good performance in the first winter regional, which was also their last event win of the season. So in the split, they had one performance that was better than their new average, one that was worse than their new average, with the other two being pretty much equal. So I think that these stats are a pretty fair encapsulation of how their defense played. And finally, we have the spring split, where things started to really fall apart for them, but we'll talk more about that later. So with all those stats out of the way, we now have a better idea of what was happening with NRG's defense. But those numbers still leave us with a really important question. Why? Like, what exactly was going wrong for this team defensively for them to go from the best defense bar none to average? Well, to answer that question, let's go back to the fall split. I mentioned that their defense was still really good despite looking slightly different. And the biggest difference had to be with Garrett and how he approached his defensive role. I said that he was the most disruptive defender on the team, and in that role, he would spend a lot of time as the farthest forward on the field, not a lot of time as the farthest back, and he wouldn't get very many saves. But in the fall split of this season, that trend began to take a little bit of a shift. He was spending less time in front of his teammates and more time behind them, while making way more saves than he did in the previous season, showing that it wasn't being nearly as disruptive anymore. The main way that this affected NRG as a whole is that without that early midfield engagement happening as often in shutdown possessions, opponents were able to get a little bit more space on the ball and were able to get more shots off, which resulted in the increase of shots allowed per game that I mentioned earlier. But since the saves they got increased at nearly the exact same rate as the shots that they allowed, their defense was still fine. And before I go into the replay breakdown to show what this looked like, I want to clarify something. This change didn't mean that Garrett was just always being passive in defense and always giving opponents free space on the ball. Garrett still played midfield disruptor pretty often. In fact, he still did it more than his teammates. But what these stats show are the few extra possessions per game that he'd be more passive than you would expect him to, which in turn would cause everybody on NRG to break their tendency for that possession. This play against FaZe Clan in the fall major is a pretty good example. Illusion clears the ball upfield, with First Killer in a spot to potentially receive a pass, while Garrett and Justin sit in front of him. When Illusion makes contact with the ball, Garrett's not only in a position where he can challenge First Killer, but he has a full tank of boost, and Justin is also rotating back with a full tank. In pretty much every scenario like this in RLCS, you would expect to see Garrett challenge the ball here to not give First Killer a free touch. And although Garrett probably didn't know this at the time, First Killer's tank is nearly empty, so he wouldn't be able to make a good play in the air even if he wanted to. This means that if Garrett goes for the ball here, he'll likely get a free touch, and probably enough space for a follow-up if his first touch is good enough. But Garrett doesn't try to get any closer to the ball, and instead drives back to the goal, letting Justin go for it. And either because of a miscommunication, or Justin simply being surprised that Garrett didn't go for the ball himself, Justin's slow to go for the challenge, and by the time he does, the ball is already falling back down to First Killer, who tips the ball off to the left before Justin gets there, giving him clean possession of the ball and the 100 boost in the corner. Seeing First Killer in the spot is always a scary sight, but NRG is able to shut it down after a 50 from Garrett and Squishy beating AJ to the ball before the shot. But this is just one example of offensive chances that would get created against NRG this season that would never happen before. And, to be fair, I should say that if he wanted to, Justin also could have challenged early. But the tendency for NRG at the time had always been for Garrett to challenge in situations like this. And if they're going to break that tendency for Justin to go in this situation, that has to be properly communicated in that moment. And in this case, I don't think it was. But I will say that the entire team being a little bit more passive like this did help them out against demos, despite the community's perception of NRG and how they handle demos. Check out my video about the demo meta if you want a deeper dive into that. So even with teams getting more pressure against them, NRG was still fine in the fall split. But moving into the winter, we start to see this catch up with them a little bit. They once again allowed opponents to get a good number of shots on them, but this time, they weren't saving them nearly as often. The extra pressure that they had been withstanding for so long was slowly starting to catch up with them, and they eventually started to struggle because of it. And these bad omens came to a boiling point in the winter major, which was arguably their worst performance as a team this season, allowing more goals per game than any other event so far, at 2.25. And before this, NRG hadn't allowed more than 2 goals per game at any point in the RLCS since Season 2, where they only barely broke that mark. So this defensive performance wasn't just bad, it was unheard of for this team. Things got so ugly for them here because they faced off against 2 teams in the group stage who were extremely capable of taking advantage of this extra space in Fury and Endpoint. In Fury's case, Yan would often take possession of the ball by himself in the back half and start a threatening play. And by the time somebody on NRG would be able to challenge, Yan would have so much control over the play that he would either be able to get the ball by them easily or would force a favorable 50 that would go right to a teammate. I broke down a play showing that exact scenario in my video after the winter major, so check that out if you want to see that example. Meanwhile, Team Endpoint was more likely to take advantage of the space with some sharp passes to open teammates. I've talked about the great passing ability of Mets and Norse and Relating Wave before on this channel, and with Seiko on the receiving end of so many of these passes, NRG wouldn't be able to keep up a lot of the time. The first part of this play follows the normal routine. Seiko has the ball, and Garrett's first to challenge him, while Squishy's already behind, and Justin's rotating back from offense. Garrett gets the 50, and the ball falls straight down to Squishy, who dribbles it out. But then when Metza comes in to challenge, Squishy tries to flick it over him. Metza gets his high and he gets the dunk, sending the ball back into NRG's defensive corner. With the way that the ball's heading, when it hits off the wall, it's going to bounce back into the middle of the field and probably into a dangerous spot. But if Garrett gets a touch on it here, he can keep that from happening and keep the ball out of the most dangerous area of the field. But whether it was because he thought Justin would go for the ball next, or he didn't trust his ability to read the bounce off the corner, he instead stays on the ground and turns back to the goal. So now the ball does kick out to the middle, and it goes perfectly to Seiko, and he takes a shot that's saved by Justin. Now the ball bounces out to the middle of the field, where no NRG players are there to follow it up. Metza grabs possession with a pretty sweet pre-flip first touch, which keeps the ball away from Squishy, who would be the only player who could challenge. Then he sees Seiko come open on a quick rotation and hits him with a perfect pass. Seiko shoots it over Garrett and into the goal. There were 2 chances here for Garrett to go for the ball. He took the first one, and it worked out pretty well with the ball going down to Squishy, but he didn't take the second one, and that ultimately ended up with Endpoint getting the goal. And I feel like I have to say this now, but despite how the video might sound so far, I'm not blaming Garrett for all of their defensive problems. I know that the 2 plays I've focused on so far have Garrett as the focal point, but that's really because it's the easiest way to highlight the difference in NRG's defense. The choices that Garrett made in these plays can work out if his teammates are prepared for him to make those decisions, but I think these plays show that they clearly weren't prepared for it. So most of the time, it's more of a miscommunication between teammates than it is Garrett just being wrong. So I just wanted to beat the Garrett G slander allegations before they even started. So with the steady decline of their defense coming to a boiling point during the major, NRG decided it was time to make a change to their playstyle, as Justin talked about in a tweet after the first spring regional. And if you watched that first spring regional, then you know that these changes didn't even come close to working out, because their defense looked really bad. They allowed almost as many goals per game as they did during the Winter Major, and they allowed a much higher shooting percentage. So while the Winter Major was rough, this is easily my vote for their worst event of the season. In the Major, they were giving up goals to some of the best teams in the world, but in this regional, they took their losses to Ghost and Rogue, getting swept both times. No shade to either of these teams of course, because they're really solid, but they're also teams that you would expect NRG to beat probably 9 times out of 10. So for them to lose this decisively each time has to be their low point of the season. The only question on my mind after I saw Justin's tweet was what exactly was the style change that NRG made, and how did it backfire on them so badly? If you look at their stats for this regional, compared to their stats for the rest of the regionals, one thing becomes very clear. They were trying to be much faster, much more aggressive, and attack way more than they did at any other point this season. There are plenty of numbers to back this claim up, including most time spent in the offensive third and the offensive half, most boosts used and collected as a team per 5 minutes, most boosts stolen, most distance traveled, second most shots taken as a team, and the fewest number of times that they got demoed as a team. The correlation for that last one might seem a little bit sketchy, but the players that are most aggressive often don't get demoed themselves nearly as often because, well, you try demoing somebody when they're constantly taking shots and pushing you into your goal. It's pretty hard to do. Since the team was being so offensive, and their defense was performing so badly, then I'm sure that you can guess that the reason why it was so bad is that they'd overcommit on offense and leave their goal wide open on counterattacks. And yeah, that's exactly what happened. But the main surprise for me was seeing how often Justin was a part of these overcommitments too. With him taking so many wide rotations back to net and playing so much goal line defense, you'd hardly ever see him overcommit. So seeing him do that so often in this event was a pretty big shock. Compared to the rest of his events this season, Justin had the second lowest time spent in the defensive third in Spring Regional 1, falling behind only Fall Regional 3. And despite spending so much less time back there, this was still the second highest event for him in terms of being the farthest back on his team. So basically what I'm saying is that Justin wouldn't be very far back on the field, but he would still be the farthest back on the field. And this aggressive positioning would get them caught out way more often than we would ever expect them to. One of the best examples of this comes in their series against Rogue. NRG has the ball in the offensive half, and they're looking to break through. After a backwards pass from Squishy, Justin throws a backwards pass to Garrett, then rotates behind him while Garrett hits the ball to the wall, looking for a follow-up hit. Gyro cuts it off and forces a 50, which sends the ball straight down to Aqua. Looking from Justin's point of view, we can see that 1, he has low boost, 2, with Squishy and Garrett both being ahead of him, he's the last man back right now, and 3, we see that Aqua's going to get clear possession of the ball, and Justin really can't do anything to stop it. Knowing all of this, we would usually expect Justin to stay back and play more defensively, especially since Squishy is setting up to get into a spot where he can play his usual shadow defense. But instead, Justin uses almost all of his boost to get really close to the play. But since he's not in a good enough spot to actually challenge the ball, he has to turn away, and then he also gets into a position of shadow. By the time Aqua passes the ball to Taroko, Justin and Squishy are right next to each other. So now not only are the two players doing the exact same thing, but now nobody's behind them in goal either. And since the whole point of shadow defense is to eventually go for the ball when the time is right, now that they're both here, neither one of them knows who should be the one to go for it. You can actually see both of them hit the brakes at the same time and prepare for a challenge. Squishy eventually flips for it, but at that point it's already too late. Taroko uses the extra time and space that he has to get 2 touches and takes a simple shot at the goal, which easily goes in. This was the main downside of the team trying to be more aggressive, and a huge reason for their really bad performance. So yeah, Spring Regional 1, or the X Games Open, if you will, was really bad for NRG. And while Spring Regional 2 was a lot better for them, it still got off to an ugly start, which is something that's really plagued NRG all season. And here, that plague showed up in the form of a 3-0 sweep against Torrent in the first round. But they bounced back in the lower bracket and got some much needed wins. including a huge one over FaZe Clan, where their defense looked to be in the same form that made them North America's best. They slowed down the region's best offense, only conceding 5 goals in 4 games. And they looked especially good when you consider the fact that NRG managed to win the series despite getting outshot in every game. But they were doing such a good job of getting reaction saves and cutting out the FaZe possessions right before it was too late. And Garrett was also back to doing his regular early challenges too. And everybody on FaZe can be really quick to the ball, especially First Killer. So there were a lot of times when Garrett got beat when he was doing these challenges. But even still, they got the job done in helping NRG make the save anyways. You can see what I mean here. In Game 2 of that series against FaZe, Sypical's touch sends the ball upfield to First Killer, who has Garrett between him and the net, while both of his teammates are in field to support the offensive push. Meanwhile, Justin is downfield getting boost before he rotates back, and Squishy is rotating into net behind Garrett. With someone behind him, Garrett dives in to try to take the ball away from First, but he can only get a deflection, which sends the ball up to the ceiling, forcing First to go up there to follow it. Now they're in a pretty scary spot, with Squishy sitting in goal, and First controlling the ball on the wall, looking to pass it down to a teammate. He eventually throws it, and Squishy can't get a touch on it, but Justin is barely able to rotate back in time to deflect the ball away from Sypical and save the day for NRG. This has to be one of the worst scenarios that you can get in this situation. But even still, Garrett challenging the ball and getting that deflection that brought it up to the ceiling gave NRG just another split second, which is all Justin needed to come back in time. If Garrett hadn't challenged there, then First Killer just would have had control on the ground, and whatever play he made would have come that much faster, and probably before Justin would have been able to come back and help. And then a few seconds later, we have Squishy shadowing, Justin rotating back from the offensive side, and Garrett's behind everybody. Squishy jumps in for the challenge out of the shadow, but he can't take the ball away from First. And despite that, Garrett turns and dives in for the challenge anyways. He gets beat cleanly, not being able to get a single touch on the ball. But in trying to keep the ball away from Garrett, First Killer can't hang on to it himself anymore. So now Squishy can grab the boost, and he grabs the ball off the back wall and air dribbles it out for a clear. And as the cherry on top, Garrett finishes the sequence with a quick double tap off the ceiling into an infield pass to Justin, who snipes the shot under the crossbar. This play had 2 more aggressive challenges from Garrett that a lot of people would probably hesitate to go for. But these challenges still gave Justin and Squishy the time and space they needed to hold down the backline, even against the best offense in North America. They eventually lost to V1 to take 4th in the event, but compared to how they did in the last event, this was a big step up. And many people were fully expecting NRG to activate their plot armor and solidify their spot in London for the Spring Major. But then, Regional 3 happened. So to this point, I've been focusing a lot on NRG's defense, and I haven't said anything about their offense yet. And that's because their offense has been fine, I guess. This part was kind of weird to evaluate, to be honest, because their stats fell between last season and this season, but I think a lot of this drop-off came because of their defense, oddly enough. Without solid and aggressive defense to win them clean possession of the ball as often, they wouldn't get the same number of good offensive looks, resulting in a lot of mediocre possessions. But when they did get the ball in the spot where they could do what they wanted, they honestly looked pretty good in my opinion. But I bring this up now because there was one huge outlier for NRG's offense. And as you've probably guessed by now, that outlier was Spring Regional 3. They couldn't get anything going on offense. And this was their worst offensive showing for not only this season, but this was their worst offensive showing for any event ever. Of course, there's plenty that went wrong here, especially in their last series against Complexity, where they ended up getting reverse swept. But all these critiques that I have for this series are only for this series, because basically none of the stuff that went wrong here happened in any other part of the season. But since this was their last series of the season, it's important to see what went wrong here so that it doesn't become a trend heading into Worlds. And the thing that really stood out to me was how often Justin was leading the charge when NRG was moving up into the offensive half. Justin is one of the best players in the world, and I don't think that he has any real weaknesses, but I think it's pretty clear that he's at his best when he's separated from the ball at first and reading the play from afar so he can pick the right spot to come in and make an impact. This is very different from players like Atomic or First Killer, who do their best work when they're on the ball as often as possible and forcing the defense to react to them. Not saying that one style is better than another because they both work, but they are very different. Atomic and First are often leading the charge on offense for their own teams, and when they do, the main thing that they have in their advantage is their ridiculous speed, being 2 of the fastest players in the region. If you're going to force the defense to react to you, then going as fast as you can is going to ensure that they have as little time as possible to make those reactions. But in Justin's case for this series, when he had the ball out in front of his teammates, he would be going pretty slow. So while his mechanics are good enough to consistently beat the first man that would challenge him, and the time that he'd take to do it, there would already be another defender in a comfortable position to follow up. So their possessions didn't create that many good scoring chances this series. This resulted in them only scoring 1 goal in the final 3 games. And you could argue that since Justin was beating one man so often, that a lot of the responsibility for these failed possessions fall on his teammates for not being there to follow up on him. which is honestly a very fair argument. But that just goes back to the point that I made earlier about not being able to blame a single player when something goes wrong. And that is definitely the case here too. Alright, so I've done a lot of talking about what's been going wrong with NRG, but now it's time to talk about how to fix it. Because, of course, I am a doctor, and that's what doctors do. Number one, and I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to say since I spent a lot of the video talking about it, but Garrett G needs to be more aggressive on the defensive end. When NRG's at their best, Garrett's up in the opponent's face, making their life difficult, and making Squishy and Justin's life easier. The playstyle change that affected NRG the most was having Garrett lose that aggressiveness, and I think that ramping the aggressiveness up instead of toning it down would have been even better. I'm not saying that he needs to turn in Riddles or Calm and look for demos whenever he gets the chance, but I will say that him doing that would have been better than the passiveness that he's been showing this season. Also, I'm going to add on one more note to this part and say that I think Garrett needs to get some confidence back. Garrett has always been one of the fastest players in North America, but during the last two regionals of the season, his speed dropped way below his average, to some of the slowest numbers out of everybody. It seemed like his speed dropped this much because of a lot of hesitation, and I think that has a lot to do with the beating that they took in Spring Regional 1, which may have shook him up a bit and made him more cautious in his movement. Now, I don't know any of these players or anything about their mentality, and I'm not going to pretend like what I just said is guaranteed to be true. I could be completely wrong, and I hope I am, but I definitely don't want to pass off that bit of speculation as a fact, because it is nothing more than just speculation. 2. Have more faith in the team's defense. When their defense started looking really vulnerable at the end of the winter split, the way that NRG tried to fight back against this was to play more offense. That's understandable enough because the best defense is a good offense and all that, but when your defense is as good as NRG's can be, I don't think that shying away from it is ever a good idea. Of course, I'm saying that after the fact with the benefit of hindsight, and making that decision in the moment is a lot tougher, but you live and you learn. What else can you say? But if a play is developing where you're going to have to be on defense, then just go ahead and play defense and don't try to force a scenario where you keep the ball on offense. I think that this note especially applies to Justin when he's positioned as a third man, because if he commits, then that means that the team is usually all in and it's do or die at that point. But it also applies to him because he's probably the reason why NRG's defense is so good, since his ability to make these last second reaction saves could be the best in all of RLCS. But to make these types of crazy saves, he needs to be back there in the first place. Now if the obvious chance is there to challenge the ball, then of course go for it. But if it's not, don't try to force it. Play defense and win the ball back slowly, which they've shown that they can do time and time again. 3. Keep up the good work on offense. Despite the team as a whole trending down, I wouldn't blame much of their struggles on offense. I thought about adding another section to this video that went more in depth about why their offense is fine, but that didn't really fit the theme of this video, since I'm highlighting mistakes. But if you want to know more about my thoughts on that, join my Discord and ask me, and I'll get back to you. And finally, no roster moves please. I know that's people's first suggestion whenever a team struggles a bit, but if there's any team that can benefit from sticking it out and working through their problems together, it's this one. Even if Worlds doesn't go well, I don't think that means the roster move is necessary. But hopefully NRG goes crazy at Worlds, and that point ends up being irrelevant. But I guess we'll find out soon enough. Alright, bye. Oh, and thanks for watching.